announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
In a world where military tensions constantly simmer beneath the surface, one event stands out. A shocking attack that almost escalated into an all-out war. Imagine this: a missile barrage, 42 rockets, launched from a distant, unseen shore. The target? The mighty USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the most formidable aircraft carriers in the world. But what happened next? It wasn't the explosive, dramatic showdown that most people expected. Instead, it was a twist that no one saw coming. A series of events that would change the course of history. In this video, we'll dive into the details of a terrifyingly close encounter between two military powers, the United States and Colombia. What sparked this unprecedented missile strike? Was it a calculated act of aggression, or was it something far more complicated? The world was on edge as the USS Abraham Lincoln sailed through international waters. But when it entered Colombian territory, things took a dark turn. As missiles cut through the sky, the world watched with bated breath. The USS Abraham Lincoln, an icon of American military might, was hit. Yet the outcome wasn't what anyone predicted. What went wrong for both sides? How did one of the most powerful military machines in the world, expected to withstand the fiercest of attacks, end up facing a threat that it almost couldn't overcome? But it wasn't just about the missiles. Behind the scenes, the political and military calculations were far more complex. Colombia, a nation not typically known for direct confrontation with the United States, found itself at the center of a storm. Was this a rogue operation? A well-planned strike? Or was something more sinister at play? The motivations for such a bold act are still being debated, with military experts and political analysts piecing together the story. As we explore the aftermath, one question remains. How did this attack, with its missiles and near-disastrous consequences, unfold so differently than anyone expected? What was the real story behind the strike on the USS Abraham Lincoln? And why did the results leave so many unanswered questions? Join us as we take a deep dive into this gripping military confrontation, uncover the facts that never made the headlines, and analyze what this near-catastrophic event means for the future of international relations and military strategy. The story of the USS Abraham Lincoln and the 42 rockets launched by Colombia is far more than a tale of missile fire. It's a story of power, calculation, and a conflict that almost changed everything. Stay tuned as we reveal the shocking details of this attack and the surprising outcome that defied all expectations. What truly happened when 42 missiles were launched at one of the United States' most powerful warships? The answer is far more complex than you might think, and you won't want to miss a single moment. In the years leading up to the attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln, tensions between the United States and Colombia had been steadily escalating, albeit quietly, under the surface. For years, Colombia had felt the pressure of its geographical location between two powerful forces: the U.S., with its vast military presence in the region, and Venezuela, whose political instability had increasingly influenced the hemisphere. While both countries had maintained diplomatic relations, underlying tensions were always present. In particular, Colombia had been grappling with the increasing presence of U.S. military bases in neighboring countries, the long-standing war on drugs, and its strained relationship with Venezuela. But there was more to the story. In late 2025, a series of covert military operations aimed at disrupting drug cartels operating in Colombia was marred by an accidental U.S. drone strike that killed several high-ranking Colombian military officers. The incident became a flashpoint, igniting national anger and drawing widespread condemnation from the Colombian government. Though the U.S. publicly apologized, many in Colombia believed the apology was nothing more than a political gesture, a temporary fix to a growing problem. Simultaneously, the Colombian leadership, under intense pressure from both the political left and right, faced rising demands from within the military for a more assertive stance against U.S. influence. Internal factions began to argue that Colombia could no longer rely on diplomacy with Washington. Some military leaders began to envision a more direct approach to standing up against what they viewed as U.S. imperialism. In the fall of 2026, whispers began circulating that certain factions of the Colombian military were working on a plan that would send a clear message to the United States. It was an audacious move, an attack on an American naval vessel, a show of power and resolve that would signal Colombia's growing willingness to defend its sovereignty at all costs. The USS Abraham Lincoln, known for its strategic importance and symbolic value in the U.S. Navy, became the target of this plan. Colombia knew that such an attack would capture the attention of the world, and they hoped it would force the U.S. to reevaluate its involvement in the region. But executing such an operation would require precision, and Colombia didn't have the same resources as the U.S. Navy or Air Force. Instead, they would rely on a combination of advanced Russian-made cruise missiles, acquired in secret during a series of covert arms deals, and a newly formed group of elite Colombian special forces. These missiles, capable of striking with deadly accuracy from hundreds of miles away, were launched from a remote coastal base located along Colombia's northern shore, hidden from prying eyes. As the attack was planned, Colombia's military worked tirelessly to ensure that the missiles would have the element of surprise. They had studied the movements of the USS Abraham Lincoln for weeks, tracking its location in the Pacific Ocean as it navigated the waters near Colombia's exclusive economic zone. They knew that such an attack could provoke an immediate military response, so their strategy was to strike quickly and then disappear into the shadows. However, they also understood that the international community would be watching, and they needed to present their actions as both justified and controlled. The goal wasn't to start a full-scale war, but to send a warning shot that would shake Washington's confidence in its ability to dominate the region. On the morning of the attack, the USS Abraham Lincoln was sailing through a particularly isolated stretch of water, unaware that it had entered a region where tensions were boiling over. The Colombian military fired off the first salvo of missiles, an impressive display of power and precision. As the rockets tore through the sky, the crew aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln had mere moments to react. Some of the missiles struck their intended targets, while others narrowly missed their mark, thanks to the ship's advanced defense systems. But the surprise wasn't just in the missiles. It was in the method of the attack. Colombia had gone beyond conventional means. The missiles were launched in a sophisticated and highly coordinated manner, with multiple points of origin along the coastline, designed to confuse and overwhelm the USS Abraham Lincoln's radar. This unexpected tactic took the crew by surprise, making it difficult for them to launch an immediate counterstrike. As chaos unfolded on the American warship, the U.S. military scrambled to assess the damage. What had started as a calculated strike from Colombia soon turned into a nightmare of uncertainty. Was this just the beginning of something much larger, or was it an isolated incident? For the first time in decades, the U.S. was forced to face a direct challenge in its own backyard. And the outcome of this attack would set the tone for the future of the U.S.-Colombian relationship and the broader geopolitical landscape in the Western Hemisphere. As the USS Abraham Lincoln sailed through the Pacific Ocean, its crew remained unaware of the deadly threat drawing closer with every passing minute. The aircraft carrier, one of the most formidable ships in the U.S. Navy, had been carrying out routine patrols near Colombia's exclusive economic zone. It was a routine mission, part of the U.S. Navy's ongoing presence in the region, which served as a symbol of American power and influence. However, the situation had been anything but routine behind the scenes. In the days leading up to the attack, Colombian military personnel had carefully positioned themselves along the northern coastline, preparing for their unprecedented assault. The operation had been months in the making, with the military ensuring every step was executed with precision. Using advanced surveillance technology, the Colombians had tracked the USS Abraham Lincoln's movements for days, gathering intelligence on its route, speed, and the capabilities of its onboard defense systems. This was no simple missile strike. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to achieve maximum impact with minimal risk to the attacking force. On the morning of the attack, the USS Abraham Lincoln continued its course as normal, unaware of the deadly trap closing in. The Colombian military, under the command of a secretive general who had risen through the ranks for his radical views, launched the first missile from a hidden coastal launch site. The missile shot into the sky, slicing through the morning mist like a knife. It was followed by another, then another, in rapid succession. By the time the first missile had struck the water near the ship, the crew had only moments to react. The USS Abraham Lincoln's defense systems, designed to intercept incoming threats, engaged immediately. But the speed and precision of the Colombian missiles caught the ship off guard. Despite the ship's advanced radar systems and missile defense technology, the attack was successful in its first phase. One missile found its mark, striking the side of the aircraft carrier. The explosion rocked the vessel, sending a shockwave through the ship and throwing many sailors off their feet. Smoke began to pour from the damaged section, and alarms blared across the ship, signaling a critical hit. Yet the strike didn't end there. As the crew scrambled to assess the damage, several more missiles followed, aiming for different parts of the ship. The Colombians had deliberately targeted vulnerable spots, areas where the aircraft carrier's defenses would be less effective. While the USS Abraham Lincoln was equipped with the latest defense technology, no system is infallible. The U.S. Navy had anticipated attacks from rogue nations or small-scale threats, but a highly coordinated missile barrage of this scale was unprecedented. The Colombian military had learned from the mistakes of others and carefully exploited the ship's potential weaknesses. The ship's radar systems, while top of the line, had not been designed to handle such a complex and rapid barrage of missiles from multiple points. The USS Abraham Lincoln's ability to track and intercept threats in a highly chaotic environment was stretched to its limits. The Colombian strike, carried out with military precision, had left the American forces reeling. As the ship's crew raced to stabilize the vessel, another wave of missiles appeared on the horizon. This time, the Colombians employed a tactic that caught the USS Abraham Lincoln off guard once again. Using smaller, more agile missiles, the attackers launched them from multiple undisclosed locations along the coast. The missiles streaked through the air, making it even more difficult for the crew to predict where the next strike would come from. With the ship's radar system still scrambling to identify the source of the attack, the crew faced the daunting task of responding to multiple threats from different directions. The situation grew more dire with each passing moment. Below deck, the damage was becoming more apparent. Fires had broken out in several key areas of the ship, and engineers worked feverishly to contain the blaze before it spread further. The USS Abraham Lincoln's flight deck, home to its vast arsenal of fighter jets, was severely damaged. Several planes were destroyed in the attack, and others were rendered inoperable, unable to take flight. Onboard personnel scrambled to repair and defend their ship, but the scale of the attack was far beyond what they had been prepared for. This wasn't a minor skirmish or a routine drill. This was a serious assault on American military might, and it had come from a surprising source: Colombia. As the battle unfolded, U.S. military leaders were watching from afar, unsure of the true extent of the damage and the identity of the attackers. With the USS Abraham Lincoln's communication systems briefly disabled by the strikes, the American forces struggled to assess the full scale of the assault. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the U.S. military had no choice but to take immediate action. Plans for retaliation began to take shape, but at that moment, the real challenge was not just surviving the attack, but understanding who was behind it and why. In the wake of the initial strike, the situation aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln quickly spiraled out of control. The ship's crew, well-trained and capable, found themselves thrust into an unexpected and intense combat scenario, facing a threat they had never anticipated: a full-scale missile assault from a foreign power, one that seemed to come out of nowhere. As the first missile hit and fires erupted below deck, the crew's primary focus was survival. The damage to the ship was severe, but the immediate challenge was preventing it from sinking or losing operational capability. With communication systems partially disabled, the ship's command center was forced to rely on secondary channels to coordinate their response. The damage control teams scrambled to contain fires and seal off compartments that were beginning to flood. But while the men and women aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln fought to keep their ship afloat, another critical issue arose: the identity of the attackers. At first, there was confusion. A missile strike from Colombia was inconceivable to most. For decades, the U.S. had maintained close diplomatic ties with Colombia, often supporting its anti-drug efforts and its struggle against insurgent groups. The notion that a nation with which the U.S. had such long-standing ties would launch an unprovoked attack on one of its most powerful military assets was almost unthinkable. But as intelligence reports began to trickle in, the reality became undeniable. Colombian forces, using a combination of advanced Russian-made missiles and sophisticated targeting systems, had carried out the attack. How and why did it come to this? Was it a rogue faction within the Colombian military, or was there a broader, more calculated plan at play? As the U.S. military scrambled to make sense of the situation, Colombia's government remained silent. Their response, or lack thereof, only deepened the mystery surrounding the attack. For hours, there was no official statement from Bogotá. The international community waited with bated breath, unsure of how the situation would unfold. Was this an act of war, or was it something far more complicated? An isolated incident, perhaps orchestrated by extremists within Colombia's military, or a result of a miscalculation in the midst of rising tensions. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, had mobilized its resources. The immediate response was to secure the safety of the USS Abraham Lincoln and prevent further damage. F-35 fighter jets were launched from nearby bases, and additional warships were dispatched to the region to protect the stricken aircraft carrier. Yet even as these measures were taken, there was an undeniable sense of vulnerability. The USS Abraham Lincoln, despite its advanced defenses, had been caught off guard by the precision of the attack. And now, with limited communication and uncertainty about the extent of the damage, the military had to figure out how to respond to a nation they had never before considered an adversary. As the situation developed, Colombian military leaders remained tight-lipped. A growing chorus of speculation emerged, with many suggesting that this attack was not the work of rogue elements, but a deliberate strike orchestrated by powerful factions within Colombia's military. The country had been under growing internal pressure for years, with increasing discontent over U.S. influence in the region. Many within Colombia's armed forces had long believed that their sovereignty was being undermined by American intervention, particularly in the context of the war on drugs. Some believed that a bold action against a U.S. military target would send a message to Washington, warning them not to meddle in Colombia's internal affairs any longer. But the attack had unintended consequences. Rather than cowing the U.S., it united American forces and galvanized their resolve. The reaction from the U.S. government was swift and forceful. President's advisors, military strategists, and intelligence officers convened to formulate a response. The initial goal was to assess the damage to the USS Abraham Lincoln and ensure the ship's survival. But even as efforts were underway to secure the carrier, plans for retaliation began to take shape. U.S. intelligence services began to sift through available data, trying to determine whether the Colombian government was directly involved in the attack or if the assault had been carried out by dissident factions. The latter possibility seemed increasingly likely, but the U.S. was not willing to take any chances. If the attack was state-sponsored, it could mean a full-scale military confrontation. If it was the work of a faction, there was still the possibility of an escalating conflict that could destabilize the region. In Colombia, the silence continued. As the U.S. Navy focused on securing the USS Abraham Lincoln, it became clear that the Colombians were preparing for something more. Military units along the coastline went into high alert, and reports surfaced that additional missile batteries had been moved into position. Was Colombia preparing for a second wave of attacks? Or were these defensive measures aimed at protecting their own shores in anticipation of a U.S. retaliatory strike? For the first time in decades, the U.S. military found itself grappling with an unprecedented situation: a major attack from a country in its own hemisphere. The attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln was not just a direct strike against American military power. It was a geopolitical challenge that could change the course of U.S.-Colombian relations forever. The question that loomed large was, how far was the U.S. willing to go to assert its dominance and ensure the safety of its forces? Would this be another localized skirmish, or would it escalate into a full-blown conflict? The U.S. military response, initially cautious, soon took a more aggressive turn. Retaliation came swiftly, but it was not the heavy-handed approach that many expected. Instead, the U.S. military, in a demonstration of both power and restraint, launched a series of targeted airstrikes against key Colombian military installations. The targets were carefully chosen to minimize civilian casualties, while sending a clear message that the U.S. would not tolerate direct attacks on its military assets. Simultaneously, diplomatic channels were opened with Colombia's government, demanding an explanation for the attack. Yet the response from Bogotá remained non-committal, fueling further suspicions that the attack had been sanctioned by high-ranking officials within Colombia's military establishment. Meanwhile, the international community was divided. Some countries expressed shock and condemnation, calling for restraint on both sides. Others, particularly those with strained relations with the U.S., viewed the attack as a courageous stand against American imperialism. The situation had the potential to spark a broader regional conflict, one that could spill over into neighboring countries, further destabilizing an already volatile region. As the days passed, the situation remained tense, with both sides preparing for what could be an unpredictable and dangerous escalation. The U.S. Navy maintained a heavy presence in the region, while Colombia continued to bolster its defenses. The world watched, unsure of how far either side was willing to go, and whether the attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln was just the beginning of something far more significant. In the end, the consequences of the attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln were far-reaching, both in military and diplomatic terms. It marked the beginning of a new era in U.S.-Colombian relations, one defined by mistrust, confrontation, and the looming specter of war. As the world waited for the next move, the question remained: would this conflict escalate, or would cooler heads prevail? The fate of both nations and the stability of the entire region hung in the balance. The aftermath of the attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln left both the United States and Colombia reeling. The effects of the attack were felt not only on the battlefield, but also in the broader political and diplomatic spheres. In the immediate wake of the assault, the U.S. military conducted a thorough assessment of the damage to the aircraft carrier. While the ship was still operational, the strike had exposed vulnerabilities in U.S. military defenses, particularly the ability to defend against a large-scale coordinated missile barrage. The attack had also sent a clear message to Washington. Its dominance in the region was no longer uncontested. In response, the U.S. began ramping up its military presence in the area, deploying additional warships, aircraft, and personnel to safeguard its interests. However, the escalation came at a cost. The international community, already on edge due to growing geopolitical tensions, reacted with alarm at the prospect of a broader conflict erupting between the two nations. Diplomatic channels were opened, but the talks were fraught with tension. The U.S. demanded answers from Colombia, but Bogotá remained tight-lipped, further fueling suspicions that the Colombian government, or at least factions within it, had been complicit in the attack. As days passed, the situation grew increasingly complicated. U.S. intelligence reports suggested that the attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln was not a rogue operation, but a carefully planned move by Colombian military leaders, possibly with the tacit approval of the highest levels of government. The attack had been a message, one aimed at asserting Colombia's sovereignty in the face of what many perceived as U.S. interference in their internal affairs. But while the Colombian military had made its statement, the consequences of its actions were rapidly spiraling out of control. Within Colombia, political factions were divided over the ramifications of the attack. Some, particularly those in the military, saw the assault as a bold stand against U.S. hegemony, a way to show that Colombia was willing to defend its interests at any cost. Others, particularly in the civilian government, were horrified by the potential consequences of the attack. The possibility of a full-scale war with the United States loomed large, and many feared the long-term destabilizing effects of such a conflict. The Colombian president, caught between military pressures and the international community's demands for accountability, found himself in a precarious position. calls for his resignation grew louder as the situation deteriorated, with opponents accusing him of failing to prevent the attack and losing control over his military. For the U.S., the immediate response was to secure its military assets and assess the long-term implications of the attack. While a direct military response was being carefully considered, U.S. leaders understood the need for a measured approach. Retaliatory strikes, although tempting, could further escalate the conflict and lead to irreversible consequences. Instead, the U.S. shifted its focus to a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and a military buildup in the region. The U.S. also sought to rally its allies, ensuring that Colombia would face significant international isolation. However, this strategy was not without risks. Several Latin American nations, particularly those with a history of tension with the U.S., voiced support for Colombia's right to defend its sovereignty. The growing divide between the U.S. and certain factions in the region added a new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. As the months passed, the consequences of the attack on the USS Abraham Lincoln began to unfold in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. While the immediate military threat had been contained, the political ramifications of the attack were profound. Colombia's relationship with the U.S. was forever altered, and the region, once seen as relatively stable, had been thrown into uncertainty. The future of U.S.-Colombian relations would depend on a delicate balance of diplomacy, military power, and strategic alliances. The attack had changed the rules of the game, and it was clear that both nations would have to adapt to a new reality. For the U.S., the question was no longer just about military superiority. It was about maintaining its influence,